Now, French politics is so screwed up and their economy is in such a bad state that this prime minister couldn't even be bothered to give being prime minister a go because the French economy is just completely backwards and headed downhill fast. And in this video, I'm going to do my best to explain exactly what's going on, why it's so bad for France, what we can expect next, and how you can protect yourself from this chaos going forward as well. And I'm actually going to be giving away a special little free gift to anyone who makes it to the end of this video, so make sure to watch out for that in a bit. Now, Prime Minister resigning after 26 days in office before he's able to do a single thing shows you that French politics is just a little bit screwed up. And before we get into what's wrong with their economy and why that's such in a massive mess, we need to go into French politics and explain why that's so disastrous first as well. Now, this all starts about 3 years ago where Macron, the president of France, he called fresh elections for the National Assembly, which is basically just the French equivalent of Congress or the United Kingdom's House of Parliament. It's where all of the elected representatives get together and debate and vote on different laws and legislation. Now, France doesn't quite have proportional representation for that National Assembly, for their equivalent of Congress. They have something called two-round voting, which does give similar results to proportional representation, but not quite the same. In essence, in France, you get lots of small parties and lots of coalitions, and there's not just this one big left-wing party and this one big right-wing party like you have in the United States. Now, Macron and his centrist party lost the majority in 2022 and they became a minority government, as you can see from this little thing here. The yellow here is the centrists, this purple was the left-wing union that was the coalition that controlled the left at the time, and then over here you have the right-wingers and then the others over here. Now, Macron did not have enough seats to actually govern the National Assembly, but he was still president, so he had to go and try and build a government, including a prime minister. He picks a prime minister from his party, and that prime minister then puts together a government, and they try to govern the country on a domestic basis, on the things that actually go on within the country, what they're going to tax people at, what they're going to spend their money on, things like that. But because Macron's party were a minority government, they just couldn't pass any legislation. So France entered political gridlock. Then Macron's prime minister used this really old, weird, anti-democratic law called Article 49.3, which basically allowed the prime minister to pass laws without ever going through a vote. But every time he did this, it caused mass outrage and mass protests and threatened to tear down the entire government. So eventually, the National Assembly, they threatened a vote of no confidence in the government if 49.3 kept being used. So Macron's prime minister had to stop using that, and then he just couldn't get anything passed through law. So he just couldn't govern, so he had to resign. Then Macron picks a new prime minister, and the same thing happens. He can't use Article 49.3 or the government will fall apart. He can't get any bills passed, so he can't govern, and he has to resign. And then Macron picks a new prime minister, and the process went on and on. And at this point now, there have been 5 prime ministers since that election where that's happened. None have managed to do anything. Now, in particular, last year, Macron saw that this was a major problem, that he's got this minority government that can't govern, and so he tried to fix that problem by getting a majority government in the National Assembly that could actually govern. Now, how did that actually turn out? Well, you can see the results for 2024 here when we click this button. 2022, as you can see here, the big yellow one is Macron's party, and it gets a lot smaller. And this time, actually, the left-wing bloc has gotten a lot larger, and so has the right-wing bloc as well. So he called these fresh elections with the idea that it was going to give him a majority government and fix the political gridlock, and in the end, he ended up doing even worse with fewer seats, and now he's still got a minority government, but it's an even weaker minority government. Now, the culmination of this whole political chaos is the economic chaos with which France is completely embroiled at the moment. And to fix that economic chaos, in short, we'll get into it in more detail in a bit, but just for now, they need to cut taxes, they need to cut spending. So last month, the old Prime Minister Bayrou, he resigned after failing to get his budget of tax rises and spending cuts passed. Then Macron goes about and does his usual thing and selects his fifth Prime Minister, Le Cornu, who then is incapable of governing, and he resigned after just 26 days, one day after he announced his cabinet, because everyone in the National Assembly, all the members of the equivalent of Congress, basically just said, if you pick those people for your cabinet, we will just do a vote of no confidence and get rid of you. And so it was clear as day he had no chance of succeeding. Now, all of this is because France's economy is entirely screwed. There are loads and loads of key issues with the economy which are just making the country poorer, but the core ones are an aging population, mass immigration, and then stagnant growth. So an aging population, really simple here, very basic idea. People get older, they work less, they're not paying as much in taxes, but they're costing the government more in services, right? In healthcare or in pensions, or they need to be supported in other ways. And also old people vote, so politicians tend to pander to them and are incredibly resistant to taking things away from pensioners because it almost always leads to lost elections. Now, this really has culminated in France with it becoming a literal pension state where pensioners control the economy, as evidenced by this graph here. It shows you the relative income of someone who is over the age of 65 and almost always retired versus someone of the average working age around about that 35 to 40 mark. For Australia, you see that pensioners make about 63% as much as someone in full-time employment. For Japan, it's about 73%. For the Netherlands and Sweden and Denmark, it's about 75%. For the UK, it's almost as high as 80%. For France, it is above 100%. That means that on average, if you take 1,000 random pensioners in France and you take 1,000 random people who are working full-time, the pensioners make more money every single month. Now, this is completely backwards because those pensioners, frankly, are dependent on the working population. And I know that people of pension age often get very, very annoyed when hearing about this because they feel like they've paid into the system all their life and it's time they get something out, but they are literally getting paid out more than they ever put back in. Now, this costs the government a huge amount of money, both in the actual spending of these pensions, but also in lost tax revenue. And the solution for this, according to the government, is actually the second problem. It's mass immigration. How do we fix an older population that's costing more and more every year? Well, globalists say that we just import cheap labor from the third world. Well, the problem with this is that cheap labor from the third world doesn't actually make you money, it costs you money. Cheap labor from the third world costs a government more than it contributes in tax revenue. Now, governments in general, in particular in the West, are incredibly resistant to giving us any kind of economic data on this sort of reality because they know it would just destroy this argument that globalists have used to, propagate mass immigration into the West. But luckily, one country is perfectly honest with the economic data they have, and that is Denmark. And they released data here which has been put into a graph, which basically shows you how much someone is going to contribute to the public purse in Denmark based on whether or not they are Danish or some other kind of immigrant or a non-Western immigrant. Now, what this really tells us is that immigrants from third world they cost the government more money in services than they contribute in taxes. Now that's very, very normal to be the case down here when you are young. Up to the age of 5 or 10 or even 20, you're not going to be working, you're not in employment, you're not paying taxes, but you are in school and you are using healthcare services and all sorts of things there. So you cost the government a lot of money. This line here is the break-even line, where you have contributed as much as you have cost. Now what we see here is Danish people, this dark blue line here, and this light blue line, Western immigrants, contribute a lot more to the public purse very quickly once they start working, to the point where they're contributing 150,000 or 200,000 Danish kroner in lifetime contributions, whilst other non-Western immigrants don't contribute as much but are still a little bit, and then third world immigrants never reach that point where they have contributed more than they've taken away in services. What this means is that importing third world immigrants in order to fix an aging population doesn't make your country stronger or the economy richer, because these people are forever and always a net drain on public finances. This data also includes their children. This is not just first generation immigrants, but second and third generation immigrants as well. So once these people have kids, the problem actually gets worse. So yes, mass immigration is making Western nations poorer, it's making France poorer as well, and it's making their demographic problem even worse. Then finally, we have the stagnant growth of the French economy. This is a graph here showing you GDP per capita of France from 1987 up until 2024 here, and everything from this point onwards is fake. This isn't real data, these are projections. Let me just make that perfectly clear. We see really, really clearly a load of economic growth in the 80s and in the 90s, and then with a peak in 2008, and then it just stagnates and actually starts to fall. It gets really bad. They are not getting richer all the way through from 2008 to 9, 10, 11, 15, 18, 2021, 2022, all the way up to 2024, where you have most recent data. They are still poorer on a per capita basis in France than they were in 2008, about 18 years ago now. 47,000 US dollars per capita, all the way up to 2024, 46,000. These here are all projections and they are laughable, to be honest. Who looks at this trend here and then decides it's just going to start going up? Well, globalists do, of course. So France is poorer today than it was 18 years ago, and that means that each person is paying in less in tax as well, despite costing more in services than they used to. Now, these three main problems together culminate into the single biggest issue with the French economy, which is just the government is spending too much money and they're strangling the economy. This here is a graph which shows you the GDP versus the government spending of a country, and you see for France, this dark red line here, it is up at about 57% right now. For the United States, it's 36%, and for Canada, it's 42%, just as some representative examples. What that means is that in France, 57% of every euro that's spent in the economy comes from government spending, which comes from taxation or government debt. For more healthy economies like the United States, it's 36%. For slightly less healthy economies like Canada, it's 42%. For a country like the UK, it's about 47% last I checked. So it is far, far too high for France. The government is just spending too much money. And as a result of that, France's debt to GDP ratio is incredibly high at 116% right now, compared to the UK's 103% and Germany's 65%. Now that is better, 116% for France, than a country like the United States or Japan, but those are complete outliers and exist in totally different realms. Japan has had, negative interest rates for decades at this point. The United States has the US dollar, which is the world reserve currency, so they can kind of just print money and borrow into infinity. And so they are under different circumstances here. But compared to comparative examples like the United Kingdom and Germany, again, France has far more debt per its GDP. And the cherry on top for this is that the cost of that debt is very, very high, and it's getting higher. The 10-year bond yield for France is currently sitting at about 3.5%, and it has been trending upwards distinctly over the last couple of years since this political crisis, with Macron not having the ability to govern the country, has been getting worse. Now, again, that may not sound like a lot, 3.5% for a 10-year bond yield. During COVID, it was literally negative at times, but mostly sat at about 0%. And then prior to that, in 2017, 2018, 2019, it was around about 1%. So the cost to service the French government's debt has gone up by about 500% over the last 10 years, because each dollar or each euro of debt has gotten more expensive, and on top of that, there's a lot more debt as well. Now, to be clear, the only possible solution here is to cut government spending, to cut taxes, and to cut regulations so the economy can actually move and grow. If they don't, they're going to have that stagnant economy. They're not going to be able to pay off their debt. That debt burden is going to get worse, and the doom loop will begin. Now, France's government is literally going bankrupt right now, and the worst thing about it is France can't actually print money to save itself from a debt crisis because it doesn't have control over the euro. And so if that happens, the French economy will basically just explode. And Macron's centrist party, well, they've been trying a little bit weakly, but they have been trying to reduce the French deficit, the amount of debt they're taking out each year, but they're failing because they just don't have a majority, and he doesn't have the votes to get a majority, and other parties are refusing to allow him to cut spending or to raise taxes to fix this economic problem. Now, I would love to say that it's just France who are facing problems like this, but in reality, every Western nation is facing an existential crisis right now, with demographic collapse and massive government spending and huge borrowing and rising yields on government debt and a rising tax burden as well. And all of this is just a ticking time bomb. So those who are relying on a state pension or a job that needs a good economy to exist, it's a very risky time, and the only true way to protect yourself from the crashes that are to come is to detach yourself from that economy. Now, back to France and what's going to happen with this political crisis and their economy next. Well, let's start off with the politics. Macron, at this point, after his prime minister has resigned and that government's falling apart again, basically has 3 or 4 options depending on how you look at it. He can put in place another centrist prime minister like his last 5 centrist prime ministers, or he can choose a new left-wing prime minister that might actually be able to break that political deadlock but will basically doom their economy forever. Or he can try and call new parliament elections to try and get a majority like he tried in 2024 but failed. Or Macron can just resign as president, admit that he's failed, leave this all behind because he's just causing too much division. Now, Macron has ruled out resigning himself countless times before. He said in no uncertain terms he will serve his whole term. Again, he's a careerist, he's a globalist. He doesn't actually care about France. He cares about being in power. So even if he is in power and that's costing his government and the people within his country deeply, he's going to maintain that power and hold on to it for as long as possible. So it's incredibly unlikely that Macron is going to resign himself. Well then, next, will he call new National Assembly elections? Well, probably not, because he tried this in 2024 and it backfired awfully. The idea, what he was going for in 2024, was actually really simple. During an election, he could argue that the left and the right should vote for him, because if they don't and he doesn't get a majority, then there's political deadlock and the government can't govern and the debt burden gets worse and the doom loop starts and the economy crashes. But in 2024, the public didn't care and they didn't trust him and they didn't want him in power either, so they just voted against him. He lost seats and ended up in a worse off position. And the polls in France showed that probably the same thing would happen this time around if he called more elections for the National Assembly. He wouldn't win a majority, he would be in an even worse position with an even smaller minority government. And that really only leaves us with the option of putting in place a new prime minister. Now again, Macron is almost certainly going to do this. At the time of me recording this video, he's almost confirmed this, but not quite. But he's not going to go for the other two. He's almost certainly going to just appoint a new prime minister and give it another go. The really important thing here then is if he goes for a centrist or a socialist. Now, at the time of you watching this video, he may have already decided, but at the time of me making this video and posting it, he hasn't announced that yet. Now, Lecornu, who was prime minister, who just quit after 26 days, he agreed to help Macron work out a plan for the government to get through this gridlock and to get things working again. Now, in my opinion, this suggests that Macron is likely to go with another prime minister from his centrist party, but that leaves us with the exact same issues as we had before, right? He won't be able to pass any legislation, he won't be able to pass the economy, and so what's the other option? Well, he goes for a socialist, where Macron will lose a large degree of control of the government. That socialist, as prime minister, gets to try and form a government and try to govern. But he also won't have a majority and will almost certainly also fail to govern. So it's really the same sort of situation, just with lesser of a political focus on Macron and his party, likely hurting their electoral processes and giving, legitimacy to the left-wing bloc as well, so hurting Macron even more in the long run. In my opinion then, the most likely outcome here is that Macron just picks another random prime minister from his party, from his central bloc, who fails and resigns within a couple of months, and this process continues on and on and on for 2 more full years of political gridlock and failure until the next presidential elections in 2027, when Macron is finally ousted unceremoniously from his horrific reign as president of France. Now, I do want to note here that there's one small outlier that I do think could happen, but is really, really unlikely. Macron could just resign as president just to then run again. Now, the biggest threat to Macron in the presidential election is Marine Le Pen, right? The leader of the French right-wing party, but she's been banned from running for president until 2027. So Macron could resign now to cause an election before she's allowed to run in the future, to try and secure even more time as president and maybe somehow get some kind of a democratic mandate. This is pretty unlikely. I personally don't think this is going to happen because it's just a little bit too high risk for Macron with not quite enough upside, but it is technically possible, and I've seen plenty of pundits online saying that this might happen. Now, what does this all mean for France going forward then for their economy? Well, it means the fundamental problems with the French economy are not going to be fixed, right? The economy will prioritize those who don't work over those who do. Mass immigration will continue, and it will continue to drain the public's finances. That massive tax burden will remain massive, and the regulation and bureaucracy with the EU as a whole, but with France in particular, will continue to prevent wealth creation. And so maybe even there will be a socialist prime minister who will come into power and make things a little bit worse, like he'll raise the already huge tax burden, he'll regulate even further and create even less wealth creation. But the problem there is still fundamentally the same, regardless of whether or not we see another centrist prime minister or a socialist prime minister. That also means that the government's debt yields will continue to rise and a doom loop will emerge. What we will see for a fact is French bond yields rising, which will lead to more government spending going up, right, to pay off those higher bond yields, to pay off that debt, which then means more debt has to be taken out by the government because none of their spending is funded, really, is it? Which means less confidence in the ability of France to pay off that debt, which means lesser investment demand, and then bond yields rise even more, and so the process continues, and that's why it's called a doom loop because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy at that point. Now at this point, if nothing changes, France is looking at actual real full-on bankruptcy and an EU or an IMF bailout within just a few years. And again, this isn't just me saying this online, this is reiterated and supported by economists and politicians and just pundits all over the world. And here's a quote from Politico right here. The funding advantage that France had in 2025, talking about the advantage they have with paying off cheap debt for their government, was still around 1.8 percentage points only 3 years ago when Meloni took power, Meloni being the person in charge of Italy today. That has steadily disappeared, having paid almost the same price as Germany to borrow for much of the last decade. Talking about France now pays more than Portugal, Greece, or Spain, Italy as well actually in that list. 3 countries that needed bailouts after the 2008 financial crisis. That is how dire the economic situation is in France, that their debt burden is more destructive and they have to pay at a higher interest rate than Portugal, Greece or Spain, the typical basket cases of the European economies. Now, the little bit of a good thing from an outside point of view here is that France itself isn't actually very important for the global economy. They don't manufacture an awful lot that we in foreign countries actually desperately need, and they don't buy an awful lot of what we export either. The downside from this is that France collapsing would pretty much doom the European Union to go the same route in its entirety, and that would then impact the rest of us. And so there are countless investors in American equities, for instance, from Europe, people like me, but plenty of investors in France as well, who would then be pulling their money out of those markets to survive that economic crash, which would hurt the markets of the S&P 500 or the Nasdaq, for instance. Of course, there are countless imports from our countries into the EU, countless tourists from Europe going around the world. If it were just France in isolation that was going to suffer, this wouldn't be too impactful. But with how the EU works and how instrumental and important France is within the EU, Europe as a whole is going to go downhill. Now, the really important thing here is that actually France's ultimate problem isn't economic, it's political. The country is too heavily divided, right? There are these middle-class socialists who care really only about intentions and feeling good about what they do and how mean outcomes don't really matter, and because they're voting against the right wing no matter what. Then there's the huge immigrant bloc who will vote and work against the right wing no matter what, because well, the right wing want less immigration, and previous immigrants and sons and children of immigrants always want more. And then there's the literal socialists and communists who are a massive political force in France. Ridiculous, I know, but they live in a complete fantasy land and they just want everything provided to them for free, regardless of how unfeasible it is. Now, Macron can't soften his stance on the right wing, the National Rally, because then he'd be admitting that they have a point, right? If they have a point, then that means that Macron and his entire party have been betraying France for well over a decade at this point. So to work with them or to accede and agree with them on anything means the death of the centrist party. And equally, the left-wing politicians are so extreme that they oppose anything other than pretty much full-on socialism. So Macron can't actually work with them either, as he's learnt since 2024. The reason he was able to win or not get destroyed and keep the right wing out of power in 2024 is because he had an electoral pact with the left, where they stepped down candidates in each other's regions to make sure that it was either a centrist or a left-winger who won, and not a right-winger. The right-wing vote was the largest single bloc. And now the left-wing are destroying Macron's government and preventing him and the centrists from governing at all, which just shows you how stupid it is to try and ally yourself with the left, I suppose, but that's the situation he finds himself in. Now, the simplest solution for all this is really, really simple. It's just for the centrists to stop being socialists, hiding away in sheep's clothing, lying to voters about who they are, right? In 2024, the election results were basically this. 32% for the National Rally, the main right wing, and then 11% for other right wing parties. That's total right-wing votes of 44%. The centrists, Macron's party in power, got 21%, less than half of that. The left wing, they got 28% of the vote. By those results alone, it's clear in day that really the right wing should be in power, especially considering how centrists ought to be fairly split between left and right. But what actually happened is the left ended up with 192 seats, the centrists with 161, and the right with just 187. How did this happen? Well, the left and the centrists, they colluded with each other to not compete, right? Purely to attack and to beat the right-wing parties. The centrists, like Macron, subverted democracy purely to stay in power. And all they have to do to break the deadlock and to fix their country is hilarious. It's to stop being closet socialists intent on destroying their own country. Now, that obviously isn't going to happen, though, because left-wing globalists who claim to be centralists are in charge. Now, this is all driven ultimately, and I go back to this time and time again, with globalists which are just closet leftists, right? They care more about artificial constructs like international law and the UN than their own people, and they care more about being in control than literally anything else in the world. Macron now finds himself in a position where he can save his country almost instantly. All he has to do is not subvert democracy, not to destroy a right-wing's chance of forming a government, even if they have the votes, and to allow the French Republic to be the democracy that it claims to be. That would, in process, however, lead to Macron losing power. He would probably not be president anymore, and he would definitely not be able to choose the prime minister anymore. And so Macron is actively choosing himself and his globalist aims over the dire needs of his country, and the tens of millions of people who will suffer as a result of this, well, they just don't matter to Macron. So yes, at the end of the day here, this is a purely political problem which is manifesting itself and public to us because of the economic consequences of it, and it all comes from globalists. Now, I honestly wish the best for France. It's a beautiful country, amazing historic culture, but my God, those globalists have done just such a brilliant job of destroying everything that used to be great about their country. Now, unfortunately, again, it isn't just France facing this issue. As I've mentioned already, the United Kingdom, my country, the whole of Europe, Canada, Australia, even the United States itself, we're all under direct threat from globalists every single day. And the only way to truly protect yourself, in my opinion, from these monsters is to make sure you don't rely on their economy to survive.